call came in just before dusk. A 24-year-old woman named Rebecca Holloway had been reported missing in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, last seen near the Forney Ridge Trail, heading towards Andrews Bald. She had texted a friend a photo of the view around 4:15 p.m., then nothing. No more messages. No responses. Just silence. Her friend had hiked back down and assumed she'd already returned, but when she wasn't at the lodge by nightfall, concern turned into panic. The rangers were notified. That's where I came in. I've been a ranger for 9 years. I've seen plenty of missing persons cases, and most of them follow a predictable pattern. Someone gets lost, turns around a few times, panics, and either finds their way back or we find them. But something about this one gnawed at me right from the start. The Great Smoky Mountains are massive, but Andrews Bald isn't particularly remote. It's just a moderate hike from Clingman's Dome, one of the most visited spots in the park. She should have been easy to find. But as I listened to the details, that uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. First problem, her last known location. Her phone's final ping came from a ridge off the main trail, an area not commonly hiked. Second problem, the lack of a distress call. Most lost hikers try to call or at least attempt some kind of SOS. But she'd gone completely silent. Third problem, the timing. Rangers who had been on patrol near Clingman's Dome around that time hadn't noticed anything unusual. No screaming, no sounds of distress, nothing. It was as if she had just disappeared. I joined this search team along with 2 other rangers, Henderson and Lewis, both experienced and level-headed guys. We set out from Clingman's Dome with enough gear to stay out overnight if needed. The temperature was dropping fast, and the fog that had been rolling in all day was getting thicker. That was another issue. Fog in the Smokies can get dangerously dense and fast. It muffles sound, distorts landmarks, and can disorient even seasoned hikers. I hope Rebecca had hunkered down somewhere safe. As we descended the trail, the woods seemed unnervingly quiet. No birds. No rustling in the underbrush. Just the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the rhythmic sound of our breathing. The fog moved in like a living thing, creeping between the trees and swallowing our flashlights. It was so thick that it seemed to drink the light, reducing our visibility to just a few feet. About 2 miles in, we found something. A phone lying in the middle of the trail. Not shattered, not dropped haphazardly. Just placed there. Screen up. Still powered on. The battery was dead, but Lewis noted something chilling. There were no signs of struggle. No broken branches, no scuff marks in the dirt, no footprints leading away. It was like someone had just set it down. I turned to Henderson. Wouldn't she have kept this on her? He nodded slowly. Yeah. Unless she dropped her pack and didn't realize, but that doesn't feel right. It didn't. Not one bit. Then we heard it. A sound drifting through the fog. A low, soft whistle. Faint. Barely audible. Almost like a tune, but slightly off. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop even though you can't explain why. Lewis turned sharply. Who the hell is that? But the whistle stopped as soon as he spoke. I felt my grip tighten on my flashlight. We weren't alone out here. We pushed forward, following the last known direction of our phone's signal until we reached a small clearing. And that's when I noticed it. The trees here were different. Their trunks bowed inward, almost unnaturally, as if they had been warped by something unseen. The ground was disturbed, but not in the way you'd expect. No footprints, just long, shallow gouges in the dirt, like something had been dragged. Henderson whispered, "This isn't right. None of this is right." His voice had lost its usual confidence. Then the whistling started again. Closer this time. I whipped around, scanning the darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the thickening fog. The sound was coming from multiple directions now, echoing unnaturally through the trees. And then Lewis said the thing I was already thinking. I don't think we're gonna find her. Not in any way that would make sense. Not in any way we wanted to. We stood in silence, the weight of the fog pressing against us, swallowing our sounds as fast as they left our lips. The whistling had stopped again, leaving behind an eerie void where sound should be. No birds. No wind. Just the faint crackle of our radios. I glanced at Lewis, who was gripping his flashlight tight enough that his knuckles had gone pale. Henderson was staring into the woods, his breathing shallow. We all felt it now, something wasn't right. I stepped forward and crouched near the disturbed dirt, running my fingers through the marks. The gouges were deep but smooth, too deliberate to be animal tracks, too wide to be anything left by hiking boots. They reminded me of the marks you'd see on a trail when someone dragged something heavy. A body? A bag? My stomach twisted. I turned back to my team. We follow this. I knew it wasn't a good idea, but we didn't have a better one. As we moved deeper, something in the air changed. The fog, dense before, took on a heavier texture, clinging to us, almost like it was resisting our movement. Our boots sank a little deeper into the earth, like the ground itself was trying to hold us back. I reached for my radio. "Command, this is Ranger Mason. We've found a potential trail. Looks like something was dragged off trail, heading southwest. Requesting guidance." Static. Nothing. I tried again. "Command, do you copy?" Still nothing. Henderson tapped my shoulder and pointed. "Mason, look at the trees." I followed his gaze and felt my chest tighten. Carvings. Deep, jagged scratches in the bark of the surrounding trees. Not initials, not names, symbols. Spirals. Crossed out eyes. Patterns that made my head hurt just looking at them. Some of them looked fresh, like the wood was still raw beneath the surface. Others were old, worn deep into the trunks. The oldest ones were nearly hidden under moss, but they were still there, staring back at us. Lewis muttered, "This doesn't make any sense. People don't just do this in the middle of the park." His voice was thin, like he was trying to convince himself. Then Henderson stiffened. "Someone's out here." I turned to where he was staring. A shape, just beyond the fog, barely visible. At first, I thought it was Rebecca. A person standing perfectly still among the trees, but something about it was wrong. Too tall. Limbs too long. The proportions weren't right. My pulse slammed into my throat as I lifted my flashlight. The second the beam landed on it, it moved. Not like a person. Like a puppet. A sudden, jerky lurch, then stillness. Lewis gasped. "Oh, hell no!" Then the thing turned and vanished into the trees. Not running, not walking, just slipping away, deeper into the dark. Henderson backed up a step. "We should call this in. Right now." He reached for his radio, but I already knew it wouldn't work. The signal was gone. The air around us felt different now, charged, like the moments before a storm. Every instinct in me was screaming, telling me to turn around, to get out of there. But then, we heard the voice. Faint. Cracked. Coming from ahead of us. Help. It wasn't Rebecca's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It didn't sound right. Like something trying to sound human, but getting it wrong. I raised my flashlight, scanning the trees. No one. The fog shifted like breath. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. Blood? Then, movement to my left. Something crawling, fast. Henderson saw it too. He turned sharply, pulling his sidearm. "Who's there?" "Identify yourself." Silence. Then, directly behind us, that whistling. Right next to my ear. Too close. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Just fog. Just the suffocating dark. And then, finally, something new, a sound I almost didn't recognize. A radio chirping to life. "Rangers, do you copy?" A woman's voice. "Command." I yanked my radio up to my mouth. "This is Mason. We're out on Forney Ridge. We found a trail, but we're not alone out here." The radio crackled. "What?" Lewis took a breath. "We need backup. Right now." Another pause. Then the woman's voice returned, quieter this time. "Ranger Mason, where exactly are you?" I frowned. "I just told you. Forney Ridge, near Andrews Bald." "No, you're not." Her voice had changed. Tense. Cold. I felt my blood run ice cold. "What do you mean?" A long silence. Then, "Your tracker isn't showing you there. It's showing you somewhere else." The radio cut to static. And all around us, in the fog, the whistling began again. The three of us stood frozen, radios hissing static as the whistling moved through the trees, shifting directions in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just one source anymore. The sound was coming from multiple places, as if the entire forest was breathing it, sending it through the trees like a warning. I glanced at Henderson. His grip on his sidearm was tight, fingers flexing around the handle as if reassuring himself it was real. Lewis had taken a step closer to me, his breathing sharp and uneven. The air was wrong, thick in a way that made my lungs feel heavier, as if we weren't supposed to be inhaling whatever surrounded us. Something all clung to the fog, something damp and bitter that I couldn't name but could feel settling against my skin like an infection. I pressed the radio to my lips again, voice steadier than I felt. "Command, repeat your last transmission. Where's our tracker showing us?" The radio crackled, static rising and falling. Then a voice, softer this time, nearly swallowed by the distortion. "I don't know." The words settled into me like a weight, pressing into my ribs, making my pulse thud harder in my ears. Henderson stiffened beside me, his controls slipping as he snapped, "What do you mean, you don't know?" A deep hum pulsed through the static, something beneath the distortion, something too rhythmic, too measured, something that sounded like breathing. Then, just before the signal died completely, the voice came through one last time, barely above a whisper. "You need to leave." And then, nothing. I swallowed hard, fingers tightening around my flashlight as I looked at the others. No comms. No backup. No idea where we actually were. The fog around us was thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I knew we needed to move. I forced my voice into something resembling authority. "We're going back. Now." Henderson and Lewis didn't argue. None of us wanted to be here anymore. We turned, retracing our steps, but the problem became clear almost immediately. Nothing looked the same. The markers we had noted before, the carved trees, the disturbed dirt, the odd gnarled branches, were gone. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself, closing us in, changing behind us. My flashlight beam swept over the trunks around us, illuminating nothing that should have been there. It wasn't just fog obscuring landmarks. It was wrong. Lewis muttered under his breath, barely audible. "Where the hell is the trail?" Henderson's face had lost its usual color as he exhaled slowly. "This isn't possible. We didn't turn." He was right. We had walked in a straight line. We should have been back on the main path by now. But we weren't. The forest wasn't letting us go. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog, the sound of footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. They weren't rushing toward us. They were circling. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness, pulse hammering in my skull. My voice came out lower, quieter. "Something's out there." Lewis exhaled sharply, and I didn't know if he meant to agree with me or argue, but his words died as soon as they left his lips because just ahead, barely visible in the thickening light, a figure stood between the trees. At first, I thought it was Rebecca. A person standing motionless among the branches, body still, limbs unnaturally rigid, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was horribly off. Too tall. Too thin. Its proportions wrong. Its head cocked slightly, like it was listening. The shape didn't shift, didn't breathe, didn't move at all. It simply watched. I lifted my flashlight, but before the beam could fully land, it flickered. And in the split second before the light cut out completely, I saw it. The face. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong. It hadn't been shaped right, hadn't been made right. Like something that had seen a human face once and tried to copy it, stretching features in the wrong places, shifting proportions too much. The eyes, too black, too deep, too empty, locked onto mine, and in that instant, my flashlight failed, plunging us into darkness. Lewis cursed under his breath, Henderson's arm jerking as he aimed his sidearm and fired. The gunshot tore through the silence, an explosion of sound that shattered the air, but even before the echo faded, the screaming started. Not from us. Not from the figure. From everywhere. High-pitched, warped, layered sounds, as if dozens of mouths had opened at once, crying out in agony. The very air around us vibrated with it, a frequency that made my teeth ache, my vision blur. It didn't sound natural. It didn't sound human. I grabbed Henderson's shoulder, yelling, "Run!" We turned and bolted, no plan, no direction, just away. The ground beneath my boots had changed. It wasn't solid anymore. The earth shifted under us, damp, sticky, like running through something that wasn't dirt. Like something alive. The fog swallowed everything as we ran, closing in around us, making it impossible to tell how far we had gone. The screaming didn't fade. It followed. The whistling had returned, too, weaving between the noise, layered into it, rising and falling like something breathing in perfect, unnatural rhythm. Then, just ahead, an opening. A break in the trees. I grabbed Lewis, shoving him forward. We burst out of the fog, hitting solid ground so fast I nearly collapsed. Henderson stumbled next to me, gasping, his gun still raised. We turned back, and the forest was gone. No trees. No fog. Just an open field under the moonlight. Behind us, only a few feet away, was the start of the Forney Ridge Trail. The same place we had left hours ago. There was no sound. No wind. No whistling. Just silence. Lewis doubled over, hands on his knees, breath ragged. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I didn't know. Henderson swallowed hard, his voice raw. We're done. We're getting out of here. I nodded, gripping my radio even though I knew it wouldn't help. I was about to take the first step when I saw it. The dirt where we had just run from wasn't undisturbed. There were drag marks, clear as day, leading right to where we had been standing. And next to them, something else, a single, bare footprint. Not ours. And too large to be human. We stood there in the open, staring at the disturbed ground, breathing like we'd just surfaced from drowning. My mind kept stuttering over the same thought: we didn't get out. We were let go. The realization sat cold in my stomach, the same way it had in past cases when a search turned from rescue to recovery. Except this time, I wasn't searching for someone else. I was the one who had almost disappeared. Lewis still hadn't straightened up, hands braced against his knees, his face pale in the dim moonlight. No way that was real, he muttered, shaking his head. No way. But his voice lacked conviction. He had seen what I'd seen. He had felt it. Henderson wasn't saying anything at all. He was staring down at the footprint in the dirt, his breathing too shallow, as if some part of him still hadn't accepted that we were standing here, that we had made it back. My fingers twitched toward my radio again, and this time, when I pressed the button, it worked. A burst of static, then the dispatcher's voice, sharp and clear. Ranger Mason, do you copy? The sound of a normal voice almost knocked the air out of me. I swallowed hard and forced my throat to work. Yeah, I croaked, then steadied myself. Yeah, I copy. Where the hell have you been? We lost your signal for over an hour. I turned toward Henderson and Lewis, but they were still staring at the ground, not looking at me. They knew. I knew. It had been longer than an hour. The last time I had checked my watch was around 8:30. But my gut told me the time hadn't just slipped. Time itself had folded, twisted around us, pulling us into something we weren't supposed to see. We must have lost reception, I said, forcing normalcy into my tone. But we're back now. A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice, laced with something that almost sounded like relief. Good. Listen, we got another call while you were out there. You're gonna want to hear this. I exhaled sharply. What is it? The missing girl's mother just got a text from her daughter's number. The world tilted. My heart slammed against my ribs. What did it say? Another pause, this one heavier. Just 3 words. I gripped the radio, my voice low. Tell me. The dispatcher hesitated, then spoke. It found me. A chill ran through my body, the kind that settled in deep, the kind that knew something had gone terribly wrong. Lewis finally looked up, his face drained of any remaining color. Henderson had gone completely rigid, his gun still clutched in his hand, knuckles white. No one spoke for several long seconds, the weight of those 3 words suffocating the air between us. Then the radio crackled again, and the dispatcher's voice came back on, this time faster. There's something else. The message was sent from inside the park. I felt my pulse hammer against my skin, my breath leaving me in a slow, tight exhale. Where? The radio stuttered, the static sharp in my ears. The coordinates put it, the dispatcher's voice faltered, then steadied. It came from where you just were. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The fog hadn't just taken Rebecca. It had brought her back. Or at least, something had. Lewis shook his head, his voice unsteady. This doesn't make sense, Mason. Her phone was dead. We saw it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that we were dealing with something explainable, something human, something logical. But I couldn't. Because I had seen the footprint. I had heard the whistling. I had seen what was in the trees. And I knew, deep in my bones, that logic had no place in whatever was happening here. Henderson finally spoke, voice low. We're not going back out there. But we both knew the truth. It wasn't up to us anymore. We didn't get to decide. The forest already had. I didn't want to go back. Every part of my instinct, the part of me that had spent 9 years working search and rescue in these woods, screamed that turning around was the worst possible thing we could do. But we weren't civilians. We were rangers, and a missing person had just spoken. The fact that it made no sense didn't matter. If Rebecca Holloway was alive, if there was even the slightest chance that she was still out there, we had to find her. Henderson knew it. Lewis knew it. That's why, even though we were shaking, even though the fear still clung to our ribs like something alive, we turned back toward the tree line. The difference this time was the forest wasn't fogged over. The woods looked normal again, if normal meant a place that had swallowed hours of our time and spit us back out somewhere else. I forced my feet forward, feeling like I was walking into my own grave. We follow procedure, I said, voice tight, controlled. Body cam footage stays on. No splitting up. We mark every turn. I let the weight of my words settle before I added, and if we hear it again, we leave. Lewis exhaled sharply and muttered, You think we'll get that choice? I didn't answer. We crossed the threshold, stepping back into the trees, and immediately, the air changed. The moment the first branch closed behind us, the silence returned. No wind. No crickets. The weight of it wrapped around my skull, pressing into my ears, making it feel like the forest itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. My hands felt damp inside my gloves. I forced them to stay steady as we moved deeper, following the same path, past the same trees, past the same places where I knew we had been before. But something was different. The ground, untouched. The markers we had left, gone. The disturbed dirt from earlier, smoothed over as if no one had ever walked here. Henderson noticed it at the same time I did. Where the hell are our tracks? His voice was edged with something close to anger, and I understood. Nature could erase footprints over time, but not this fast. The earth had been churned up before, But now, it was flat, empty, wrong. My pulse throbbed against my skin. Then, up ahead, a light. Faint, flickering, coming from somewhere just beyond the next clearing. We stopped. None of us spoke. None of us had turned on our headlamps. None of us were shining our flashlights in that direction. And yet, it was there. Lewis swallowed, barely audible. Someone else? No one answered. Because we all knew. No one should be here. The light pulsed, almost like it was breathing, a rhythmic flicker, soft, like candlelight. I stepped forward slowly, my boot pressing against something cold. I looked down and saw it, a phone. I bent down and picked it up. Rebecca's phone. The same one we had found before. The one that had been dead. But now, the screen was on. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. The lock screen showed the same picture from before, the photo she had sent her friend at 4:15 p.m., just before she disappeared. But something was different. Something that hadn't been in the first version. A figure stood in the tree line. Barely visible in the distance, just behind the trees. Not moving. Not facing the camera. Just standing there. A cold weight pressed against my spine. My hands felt clammy against the phone's smooth surface. Had it been there before? Had we just not noticed it? Then the screen flickered. The photo changed. The angle was the same. The trees were the same. But the figure, it had turned. It was facing us now. The shape was vague, too far to make out details, but the stance, the tilt of the head, the way its arms hung wrong, everything about it felt off. The more I stared, the more I thought I could see the edges of its mouth. Too wide. Too long. Curving up into something that wasn't a smile. I dropped the phone. The second it hit the dirt, the light in the clearing went out. The silence deepened, and the air grew heavier, thicker, pressing against my ribs like something breathing against me. My vision blurred at the edges. I turned to the others, saw their wide eyes reflecting my own fear. None of us moved. None of us spoke. Then the whistling started. Right behind us. Too close. We turned at the same time, flashlights sweeping the trees, catching nothing but tangled branches and the endless, watching dark. But the sound was still there. Louder. Echoing. And then, a voice. Cracked. Weak. Coming from the direction of the clearing. Help. Lewis took a shaky breath. Rebecca. But something inside me screamed that it wasn't. The voice, it was wrong. Thin. Hollow. Like something trying to sound human but failing. I turned to the others. We leave. Henderson hesitated, his jaw tight. We can't, then the light came back. And Rebecca was standing in the clearing. Or at least, something that looked like her. Her hair was wrong. Her posture was wrong. Her arms hung too stiffly at her sides, and her eyes were open too wide. Her mouth moved, but her lips barely parted, and when she spoke, her voice came out flat. I found you. The words sent something cold into my chest. Henderson lifted his radio, hand shaking. Command, we have visual on the missing subject. Rebecca's head jerked. Not a twitch. Not a shiver. A full, unnatural, snapping motion like her neck had been pulled by an invisible string. And then, she started walking toward us. I took a step back before I even realized I was moving. My body had already made the decision before my mind could process it, before my training could kick in, before I could rationalize that what I was seeing wasn't possible. Rebecca's frame moved toward us in slow, unsteady strides, but her legs weren't doing all the work. There was something wrong with the way she moved, like invisible hands were jerking her forward in stiff, unnatural pulls, her head still tilted at that sickening angle, eyes too wide, mouth still parted just enough to show teeth. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but her fingers twitched like something inside her was testing them. I felt Lewis breathing too fast beside me, his flashlight beam shaking violently as it illuminated Rebecca's form. I wanted to tell him to shut it off, to stop shining light on whatever the hell was moving toward us, but my own arm refused to lower. Henderson was the only one who spoke, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Rebecca." She stopped. Not gradually. Not the way a person naturally slows. She just froze. Like a string had been pulled tight, like something had halted her mid-step, her feet still slightly off the ground. Then, very slowly, her head jerked again, a sharp, snapping motion that sent a deep, wet crack through the silence. My stomach twisted as my own body recoiled. The way her neck bent shouldn't have been possible, but her body acted as though the unnatural movement was completely normal, like it was something she had done 1,000 times before. Then she spoke again, but this time it wasn't the thin, hollow whisper from before. Her voice came out wrong, layered, as if 2, maybe 3 voices were speaking at once, tangled together in a way that made my brain reject the sound before I could even process the words. "I found you," she said again, but it was different now, slower, deliberate, amused. The second she finished speaking, she moved again. I grabbed Lewis by the jacket and shoved him backward as Rebecca lurched forward, but she didn't run, she didn't need to. The moment her foot struck the dirt, the ground underneath us moved. It shifted, it breathed, and suddenly, we weren't standing on a familiar trail anymore. The trees around us changed, their trunks stretched unnaturally high, their branches curling at impossible angles, the spaces between them wider, darker, a void stretching farther than it should. The air turned thick, pressing against my skin, the silence absolute. No radio static. No wind. No sound at all except for Lewis's sharp breath, Henderson's low curse, and the steady, slow clicking of Rebecca's jaw opening wider. My boots felt heavier, my body slower, as if the forest itself was pressing against us, resisting our movement, trying to hold us in place. I turned, forcing my legs to move, shoving through the impossible weight in the air. "Run." Lewis took off first, his boots hammering the dirt, and Henderson wasn't far behind, but I had to glance back just once, just to see if she was still following. She wasn't. She was standing still, her mouth stretched too wide now, her lips peeled back, her eyes too large, too black. She wasn't chasing. She didn't have to. Because the forest itself was moving. The ground beneath my feet suddenly wasn't solid anymore. I felt it shift, my boots sinking slightly, and then the realization hit me with an ice-cold grip, it wasn't dirt. I stumbled, forcing my body to keep moving, to not think about it, to not think about how my own footprints were vanishing the second I left them, how the trees were closing in the farther we ran, the space between them narrowing. Lewis was ahead, barely visible now, Henderson just to my right, but the second I turned forward, we were where we had been. The path was gone. There was only a clearing, a wide, empty space where the trees bent inward, their tops leaning toward each other like reaching fingers. The air was heavier here, thicker, pressing into my chest, wrapping around my ribs like something alive. And at the center of it stood a shape, not Rebecca, but something else, something tall, something wrong, something standing too still, its face featureless except for its mouth. And it was smiling. My radio hissed back to life, a woman's voice, faint, barely audible through the static. "Rangers, get out, leave now." The voice on the radio barely cut through the thick, pressing silence, but I heard it. Every muscle in my body tensed as my grip on the radio tightened, my pulse slamming against my ribs in uneven beats. Henderson was frozen beside me, his breath sharp and uneven, his gaze locked on the figure in the clearing. Lewis was the first to react, muttering, "No! No, no, no," under his breath as he took a step back. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But something about the thing standing in front of us held me there. The way it stood, motionless, its body too tall, its limbs hanging at angles that weren't quite natural, its face empty except for that horrible, too wide mouth, it wasn't just looking at us. It was waiting. I forced my thumb against the radio's button, my voice barely steady. "Command. Do you copy? We need immediate evac. Something is wrong." The static surged, the woman's voice breaking through in sharp bursts. "You aren't supposed to be there. My stomach twisted at the words, at the way they didn't sound like a command but a realization. Henderson heard it too. His eyes flicked toward me, his face pale beneath the shadows, the light from his flashlight trembling across the clearing. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both knew what we were thinking. Lewis moved first, shifting his weight, taking another slow step backward, but the second his boot pressed into the dirt, the thing in the clearing moved. Not a step, not a lean, a sudden, unnatural jerk, like its entire frame had been pulled forward an inch by invisible strings. The movement sent a sharp, sickening tension through my spine, the same sensation as watching something that had been dead too long start to move again. The ground under my feet wasn't solid anymore. I could feel the way it pulsed, the way it almost pushed back against my weight. The trees weren't just watching, they were shifting, tilting toward us, closing in as if the forest itself was inhaling. "Go," I whispered. "Now." Lewis didn't hesitate this time. He turned and ran. Henderson and I were right behind him, our boots slamming against the dirt as we pushed forward, away from the clearing, away from that thing. The trees blurred around me, the air thick, humid, pressing against my lungs as if the atmosphere itself was trying to drag us back. The whistling started again. It wasn't coming from behind us. It was ahead. Twisting, looping, circling through the trees. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was making that sound, but my instincts were already screaming that it wasn't just one source. The forest was full of them. Henderson gritted his teeth, pushing forward, his breath sharp with exhaustion. "Keep moving," he growled. "We have to." His foot suddenly caught, his body lurching forward as he crashed hard into the dirt. I skidded to a stop, grabbing his jacket, hauling him up even as the ground seemed to shift under us. His leg wasn't caught on a root. Something else had grabbed him. I didn't see it, but I felt the way he jerked in my grip, the force pulling him down, the way his face twisted in horror before he tore his leg free. We ran. The air changed. The deeper we went, the more it became wrong. The night stretched, impossibly long, the trees warping, their branches bending at angles I had never seen before. My vision swam, my legs growing weaker even though we had only been running a few minutes. Something was messing with our heads, with time, with the way the world moved around us. Then, up ahead, a break in the trees. An opening. A path. I didn't trust it. But I trusted staying here even less. We sprinted toward it, the woods breaking open into a wide, empty stretch of road. Asphalt. Man-made. Real. My breath caught in my throat, my body still tense for a trick, for a sudden shift that would leave us trapped, but the dirt under my boots turned solid. It was real. We had made it. I turned sharply, expecting to see the trees still shifting behind us, expecting to see Rebecca. Expecting to see whatever had been in that clearing. But the woods were still. Silent. Empty. Lewis bent forward, hands on his knees, sucking in deep, uneven breaths. Henderson had collapsed onto the ground, rubbing at his leg, checking his gear, still shaken but alive. I pulled the radio back to my mouth, forcing my voice to work. Command. We made it. We're out. There was a long pause, followed by a slow exhale of breath. Then the woman's voice returned, this time steady, firm. Do not go back in. I swallowed hard. I wasn't planning to. But I already knew this wasn't over. We stood there on the road, surrounded by silence, the only sound the ragged pull of our breath as we tried to steady ourselves. The forest was behind us now, but the weight of it still pressed against my skin, still curled in the pit of my stomach like something waiting to take hold. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that we had made it out. What mattered was that, for the first time in hours, or had it been longer, I was standing on real ground. But as much as my body told me we were safe, something in my gut told me otherwise. Henderson wiped a hand down his face, his fingers still shaking as he looked at the tree line. His voice was hoarse, barely above a breath. That wasn't the park. I knew what he meant. I had spent years patrolling these trails, knew every stretch of land within this park, and I had never seen a place like that. It wasn't that we had gotten lost. It was that we had been pulled somewhere else. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if we hadn't made it out. If it had caught us. Louis hadn't stopped looking at the ground, his fingers curled against his knees, his body hunched forward. "I don't care what we saw," he muttered, his voice edged with something close to panic. "I don't care. We're done. We're not going back in." He finally lifted his head, eyes locking onto mine. "Right?" I didn't answer. Because I knew the truth. Rebecca Holloway was still missing. Maybe she was already gone. Maybe there was nothing left of her to find. But I had seen what happened to people who went missing in these woods. They didn't come back. Not whole. Not right. The radio crackled in my hand, breaking the silence. "Ranger Mason," the woman's voice returned, steady now, controlled. "Status?" I swallowed hard, forced my voice to work. "We're out." We made it to the main road. No visual on the subject. Another pause, then, "Stand by for further instructions." Stand by. That word sat wrong with me. They knew. Whoever this woman was, she knew. I turned back toward the tree line, my breath slow, controlled, my fingers tightening around my flashlight. The woods had returned to their familiar shape, the normal stretch of the Great Smoky Mountains I had walked 1,000 times. The trees were still. The path was visible again. But I knew, deep in my bones, that if I stepped forward, if I crossed that invisible line, it wouldn't be the same forest waiting for me. Henderson shifted beside me, still rubbing his leg, still checking for wounds that weren't there. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I've seen bad things out here," he muttered. "Falls. Animal attacks. Hypothermia. But this?" He looked up at me, his jaw set. This was something else. I nodded. It was all I could do. Louis let out another breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "So what now?" The radio crackled again. "Rangers," the woman said, voice lower this time. "We have a problem." I didn't speak. I just waited, heart pounding, knowing whatever she was about to say would change everything. Rebecca Holloway's phone just sent another message. The static pulsed. My fingers clenched around the radio. What did it say? The woman hesitated. Then, finally, "It's not her." A chill crawled down my spine. My grip tightened. I already knew. We had left something behind in those woods. But something else had followed us out. The road stretched empty ahead of us, dark and silent, the weight of the night pressing against my ribs. The words from the radio echoed in my head, looping, repeating, sinking deep into something instinctive, something I didn't want to name. "It's not her." I had known at the moment I saw her standing in that clearing, the way her body moved like it was being controlled by something that didn't fully understand how people worked. The way her mouth moved just a fraction too late when she spoke. We had gone looking for Rebecca Holloway, but what we found wasn't her. And now, we had made it out. But had we really left? Had all of us really left? Henderson sat down hard on the pavement, still rubbing at his leg, his breathing uneven as if something was still wrapped around him, something that had let him go but left its mark. Louis hadn't spoken again, just kept his hands pressed against his face, as if he was trying to wipe away whatever had happened, trying to erase it from his own skin. I lifted the radio again, my voice quieter this time, words slow, measured, steady despite the way my pulse still hammered against my ribs. "Command. Repeat." "Who sent the message?" The static dragged for a moment, long enough that I thought maybe we had lost the connection again, but then the woman's voice returned, softer now. The message came from Rebecca Holloway's number. A pause, another burst of static. But it wasn't sent from inside the park. I felt my breath stop in my chest, my entire body locking in place. My fingers twitched around the radio, but I forced my voice to stay level. Then where did it come from? The pause this time was longer. When she spoke again, I could tell she didn't want to say it. Near your location. The trees behind us were silent. The road ahead stretched into the darkness. My flashlight beam cut against the pavement, slicing through the humid air. I turned slowly, my breath slow, controlled, scanning the tree line, searching for movement, for shadows, for anything out of place. And then I saw it. A figure. Standing just beyond the trees. Watching. It wasn't moving. It wasn't approaching. Just waiting. At first, I thought it was her again. Rebecca. Or the thing that had been pretending to be Rebecca. But as my flashlight settled on it, I realized something else. It was too far. The trees weren't close enough for me to see detail. It was just a shape, a shadow. But I knew, deep in my chest, that it was watching us. My hand pressed against my radio. Command, we have. A noise cut through the static. Not feedback. Not a voice. A whistle. Long, slow. Right behind me. I turned fast, my heartbeat slamming into my ribs so hard it made me lightheaded, my breath catching in my throat. But there was nothing there. Just Lewis and Henderson, both frozen, both staring at me, their eyes wide. I could tell from their expressions that they had heard it too. I didn't know what to do. I had no plan. No protocol for this. I had trained for almost everything the park could throw at me, but not this. Then, in the distance, something moved. Not the figure in the trees. Something closer. A shape stepping out onto the road. The flashlight beam caught the face, and my stomach dropped. My body locked, my mind screaming that this wasn't possible, this wasn't happening. Because it was me. The figure standing in the road, just beyond the reach of the light, was me. Same uniform. Same boots. Same stance. But the face, it wasn't right. The skin was pale, too smooth, stretched tight over the bones like it had been shaped, not grown. And the eyes, they were black, endless, nothing but voids carved into something that wasn't quite human. Its mouth twitched, the lips pulling into something that was almost a smile, almost an expression, but wrong. Like it was testing the movement, like it was trying to see how it felt. I felt my chest tighten, my muscles tensing as my own reflection stood there, tilting its head just slightly, watching. Henderson was whispering something under his breath. I couldn't hear what. Lewis took a slow, shaking step backward. But I didn't move. And then it spoke. The voice was mine. But not. Flat. Empty. Not quite right. I found you. The flashlight flickered. The road went dark. And the whistling started again. It didn't come from one direction this time. It came from all around us. The trees. The road. The sky. A chorus of slow, deliberate notes, weaving together, rising and falling, circling, closing in. I reached for my radio, my fingers numb, my breath sharp as I pressed the button. Command, we need. The static screamed. Sharp. Splitting. A burst of sound so loud it made my vision blur, made my ears ring, made my knees nearly buckle. Henderson and Lewis clutched their heads, the noise drilling into our skulls, a high-pitched, keening wail, not feedback, not interference. A warning. And then, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy, swallowing the air. I turned back toward the road. The figure was gone. The trees were still. The dark was just dark. The radio crackled again. The woman's voice, steady. Calm. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I didn't argue. I didn't look back. We moved. We ran. We didn't stop until we saw the headlights of the Ranger truck cutting through the night, the sight of it almost enough to make my legs buckle. I don't remember the drive back to the station. I don't remember much after that. Just the feeling of being watched. The sense that even though we had made it out, we had left something behind. Or maybe something had come with us. Rebecca Holloway was never found. A search team combed the park for weeks, but there was no trace of her. Not her body. Not her gear. Not even her footprints. Her family never got an answer. Just another name added to the long, growing list of people who had walked into the Smoky Mountains and never walked back out. But sometimes, while I'm on patrol, I hear it. Somewhere out in the trees. The whistling. And I know, it's still waiting.